The Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, August 1st, 2023 is now called to order. Andrea, would you please call the roll?
Good afternoon, everyone. It is now 1:15 p.m. As a reminder to all in attendance, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the county's YouTube page. Calling the roll, Mr. Schran. Ms. Conwell.
Present.
Ms. Turner.
Present.
Ms. Stevens.
Present.
Ms. Simon.
Here.
Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Present.
Mr. Sweeney.
Present.
Mr. Tuma.
Here.
Mr. Gallagher. Council President Jones.
Here.
You have a quorum.
All right, thank you. Andrea, has anyone signed in for public comment?
Yes, Mr. Joel Freelick.
Good afternoon,
Afternoon.
Mr. President, members of council. I'm Joel Freilich. I'm the Director of Service Management for the RTA, and the county administration asked me to come here and say a few words about the potential jail site in Garfield Heights. Just 3 basic points I want you to be aware of. The RTA operates bus route 90 on Transportation Boulevard along the east side of this proposed site. The service frequency, which we believe is stable for the long term, is every 30 minutes all day on weekdays and every hour on weekends and 7 evenings a week. It runs from early morning till quite late into the evening. The RTA staff has already met with county administrative staff, and we're committed to continue to work with them and their design team, if this goes forward, on designing the site in such a way that is most conducive to access by public transportation. That involves planning so that the most transit-dependent activities that happen on the site could be placed preferably closest to Transportation Boulevard on the site. The last point I'd like to mention is that the current alignment of the Route 90, when it comes from downtown, it does pass directly and is capable of stopping opposite the site driveway on Transportation Boulevard, and it is likely that it would stop opposite the site driveway on Transportation Boulevard. In the opposite direction, however, the current alignment of the bus can't actually stop at the site driveway because the bus is traveling south on Transportation Boulevard and is already in the left lane preparing to make a left turn onto I-80 West leading to I-77 North. This can be remedied, and we've discussed this with the county administration. Should this site go forward, we will help the county and the consultants design a bus turnaround on the site very close to that Transportation Boulevard entrance. That way, instead of moving into the left lane, the bus can continue in the right lane, turn into the site, use the loop to turn around, pick up passengers, drop off passengers, and then proceed straight across through the signalized intersection that already exists to get onto the freeway. There may even be some years in which the schedule permits the bus in the other direction, which doesn't absolutely need to go onto the site. There may be some years in which even the bus in the other direction can go onto the site for extra convenience for people coming to and from this site. So I just want to let you know that the RTA stands ready to assist, as we will assist other developers and other municipalities with sound advice on site design to make it pedestrian and transit friendly. Thank you for your time.
Kareem Hinton.
Good afternoon, Kareem Hinton, representing the Cuyahoga County Jail Coalition. I'll start off by saying when I listened to the RTA representative that I just heard, I also heard dollar signs. Money, 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 money that residents are going to have to pay. So please don't take that lightly. It will cost over $1 billion in the end after moving not just the jail, but also the courthouse. I do not want my grandchildren to have to pay for this. Nobody wants, NIMBY, not in my backyard. This is not going to help people's property taxes. Property values go up. In fact, it would likely have the opposite effect. Nobody says, hey, I want to move into this area because they've got a great jail facility. Also, being that we acknowledge that we have some very irresponsible-minded folks that are operating this jail system or even the criminal justice system here, much like the movie, if they build it, if we build it, they will come. If you build it and you build it irresponsibly, they will fill it. I contend that you keep the jail where it is, where it's in close proximity to the services that people need. And I want to get back to the NIMBY thing, not in my backyard. Understand that providers need to be near this facility. While the campus will have places for offices for some of these providers, what about the services for the folks who have gotten out of jail? They're supposed to go back to jail to get these services. Providers are going to need to set up their offices around the area. And so we're talking about shelters. How many residents are going to want shelter for the homeless in their neighborhood? Let's be honest. So you're going to have folks fighting against it. And so between zoning and citizen-led campaigns, you're going to get resistance. I contend that you leave it where it is, where anybody who's moving near where the current jail is, they knew what they bargained for when they got there. But by moving it there, there are people that did not sign up for that. They will not want it. And so how do you respond to them? Is it moving near your homes? I would say not. So it makes for an easy decision for some folks to make if they are disconnected. And so I would just say that it costs less to fix the current jail and leave it where it's at. Stop thinking in terms of long-term sun deprivation and so forth, because that's a mindset of folks who want to house people long-term. That is not a correctional facility, it's a jail. Thank you.
Jeremiah Methuselah. Thank you.
The county can do better than spending $1 billion on cages. for
Mr.
poor
Methuselah, can you state your name for the record,
people. My
please?
name is Jeremiah Methuselah. The county can do better than spending $1 billion on cages for poor people. Please reconsider.
Pat Dillard.
Good afternoon. I am Pat Dillard. I live in Cleveland Heights.
Ms. Dillard, if you could position the microphone closer to you and speak a little louder.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Pat Dillard. Good afternoon. I live in Cleveland Heights, and I'm here today to address the issue of the location of our county jail. As you know, there are many conflicting ideas on this issue. A solution I have not heard recently is to demolish one of our 2 jail buildings on the site that we already own and build a new one in its place. The current population of the jail could be housed in the building left standing until the new jail was finished. At that time, the remaining building could be remodeled or demolished and rebuilt to provide ancillary services. With the current efforts to reduce the number of people in jail, pretrial or otherwise, the remaining jail would be adequate to house the residents. Now, the cost of commercial demolition, as I researched it, is $4 to $8 a square foot, with large buildings coming in at the lower end. The 2 jail buildings combined are around 700,000 square feet. For example, if we demolish the older jail, the demolition cost would come in below $3 million. Even if it turns out to be somewhat more, it's a great bargain, excuse me, compared to purchasing new land for tens of millions. Using the site we already own would also avoid the major transportation issues of additional costs and ensuring safety. If a jail is located off-site, roughly 130 inmates would need to be transported every day to jail, to the court and back. At any time, officers could be transporting males, females, and even juveniles who have been bound over. They might also need to transport prisoners with physical disabilities or who are wheelchair-bound. In one trip, officers may find themselves transporting dangerous prisoners in the same vehicle as people charged with minor nonviolent offenses. Keeping prisoners under control can be difficult, even in a controlled institutional setting, but it can be especially problematic during transport. Even if when some prisoners may be seeking opportunities to escape. Even if they're not, prisoners can misbehave and endanger the safety of correctional officers, other prisoners, and even themselves, as has been experienced in other jurisdictions. The costs of purchasing and maintaining specialized vehicles, plus the mileage costs, will be high. The higher costs will be the ongoing salaries of the many drivers and officers who will be required to accompany the prisoners, and the safety of both the prisoners and the officers. Let's look at a situation that everyone can agree on. Let's build a new jail on the optimal site we already own.
Lou?
Good afternoon, everybody.
Afternoon.
Now, number one, talking about transportations, the sales tax you may extend within your powers. Why not invest it in our public transportation itself? Right now, only number 90 can go to Garfield Heights, that particular site proposed. Back in 90s, look at how well our GCRTA actually could provide big, good coverage and stable frequencies to service the whole county. Now, we only ended up with one line, only 30 minutes and not even 24 hours. That does not really offer the ideal situations for the visitors and for the workers and for the inmates who probably will be released at any time, any given date, any given time. Second, all the wraparound services, even they may have a spot on the campus. But the problem is, they are not there 24 hours either. They only also have a limited hours there. That will not be sufficient to help all the people working there and staying there. So what's the use to have them only for certain hours so we just can claim, oh, we have the service? Just like how we have done to other services we have. County intends to offer good services, but lots of time, due to the politics and the economy, lots of things have been cutting corners. Not in your backyard, not in my backyard, not in everybody's backyard. Unfortunately, homeless population is at your front yard, left yard, everywhere. Do we want all the people suffer more? Having more people staying in the county jail, doesn't matter where that is. Based on the enlightenment we received from Councilman Gallagher, that will actually prolong the process to have a bail reform and other meaningful improvement for everybody's life in this county. So please, do not opt for bigger new county jail at any site in addition to some other crazy ideas. We can actually do some improvement in downtown areas, which public transportation has been there. Safety issue will be less. Future costs to transport people back and forth will be less. Because, don't forget, the other side of the government has not been doing their jobs. They should do their part. They should not put the burdens on ordinary residents in the county this generation, next generation, and next generations. Thank you very much.
Josiah Quarles.
Good afternoon. My name is Josiah Quarles. I represent Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless. I'm here today, like many days, talking about the new jail proposal. I would like to lift up some of what was already stated a little bit. When we think about, programming and housing and restoration of our communities and those impacted and involved in the criminal legal system, I think what we need to do, one, is center human beings that are involved, as well as their families, as well as the cost to the general public to do these tasks. I think it is very high-minded and noble. A lot of the infusions that this body and others are attempting to make into this carceral organism, right? But I find that most of that infusion would be better served when placed into community. So I am all for more mental health beds, right? All for more treatment, all for more work programs, right? All for more educational opportunities. But these should not be leveraged in a coercive fashion in which the only access point to them is to be incarcerated. And I think we're conflating two things. There's the housing that needs to take place because we have not done a good job of bail reform, and that burden is placed on people to pay their way out of their circumstances, right? So there is an immediate need to house individuals because we have not made the changes that we need to make in that situation. But to expand that and make a project that is supposed to encompass, basically years of people's lives, and that's not the point of what the jail is, right? That's not what we're supposed to be building here. So I think if we separate the two things and we deal with them one at a time, and we are, and we reach out to community to understand like what the needs are and where the best access points are, I think that's where we should be investing our money. The downtown space right now, there are a lot of problems. But as was spoken before, we could remove one aspect of it, expand another, right? And do a lot to remediate the problems that we have on the current site and distribute the funds that we're talking about that would be taxed and impact low-income folks better in community. So I would just like to reframe this question for this body, and I hope that you are able to receive that. Thank you.
That concludes the public comment portion for today's meeting.
Right. Matters referred to committee. Madam Clerk, if you'd read the item into the record.
Resolution 2023-0181, approving a cooperative agreement with the City of Cleveland and a to-be-formed nonprofit corporation to be known as the North Coast Development Corporation to facilitate development and redevelopment projects on the City of Cleveland lakefront.
Is someone from the administration to speak to this matter?
Good afternoon, County Council President and Council. My name is Eric Wipser, presenting on behalf of the administration today. Just following up on the presentation that I made in the previous meeting, we heard a lot of concerns from Council as it related to the proposed agreement. We began conversations through staff with the City of Cleveland, and ultimately were able to make some significant progress, we think, on many of those issues. I want to just provide an update on those today. Hold on one second. There we go. Okay. So first, there were some questions specifically as to how much of this organization would be dedicated to the renovation of Brown Stadium. And I stated that it was not the intent. I believe it was Councilwoman Simon that pointed out there was a reference to the renovations of Brown Stadium. We talked to the city of Cleveland. And the one thing that we want to make clear is that this organization is predominantly dedicated to the connection to the lake, the improvement of the public lakefront space, and then the appropriate development along that space. The city and the Browns both agreed that striking the Cleveland Browns renovation or stadium renovations from the proposal altogether was satisfactory. So the newly contemplated agreement would strike any statement as to Brown Stadium. In addition to that, one of the other concerns that we heard, hold on, there we go, was that there wasn't enough county representation on the board. We discussed that with Cleveland as well. And the seat that was going to be appointed directly by the governor, the agreement now contemplates that would be a seat that would be appointed by the mayor with the approval of the council or the county executive. And then in addition to that, I believe it was Councilwoman Conwell that raised having the initial ability to approve the executive director of the organization, that she would have liked to see more say from the county as to the hiring of the executive director. So now for the entire 3 years of the agreement that council is contemplating, if the executive director were to leave the position and were to be reposted, that approval would last for the entirety of the agreement with the county to have an approval power over the county, over the appointment of the executive director. And then finally, it was raised about whether this body would be subject to sunshine laws. We had a robust discussion with the city of Cleveland about what was possible. What they are proposing is that while this is a nonprofit, that we cannot specifically bind, or they do not recommend specifically binding to sunshine laws, that they agree to hold at least one meeting open to the general public annually to provide for the ability for public comment to be received and considered at meetings, to make an annual accounting of all public funds received and spent, and then at the discretion of the board to adopt any other public record or open meetings policy. The other distinction that was pointed out is that as a 501c3, this organization does not have the authority to conduct any public business or any what would be traditionally public authorities, but that if they did adopt, as is the intention in the future, a new community authority, that would, by Ohio law, be subject to sunshine laws. So any public business that would eventually get done by the new community authority would be subject to sunshine laws. And then the 501c3 would honor the commitments that made as to holding at least one public meeting, providing for public comment to be received and considered, and making an annual accounting of those public funds. That is the extent of my presentation, though I'm happy to answer any questions from council.
Any questions from council? Councilwoman
I just
Conwell.
needed clarification. Thank you through the president to Mr. Wobser. You stated, I think it was the second item that you presented, the county exec and the mayor will, since the state gave up their spot, they will now make a determination on the together on the executive director's position. Is that only for that first time, or is that for all 3 years?
Through the council president, just to make a quick distinction, the governor's appointment is as to a board seat. So what was initially contemplated was that the council president would have one appointment and that the county executive would have one appointment. In addition to those two appointments to the 13-member board, instead of a gubernatorially appointed seat, there will be a joint appointment of the city and the county. Separately from that is the appointment of the executive director or the staff of the organization. We will have approval power for the executive director for the entirety of this agreement. So upon the initial hire, we'd have to approve the executive director. If that person were to vacate that seat at any point during the 3-year term of this contract, a new appointee to that seat would have to be approved by the county at any point during the period of which the county is in this agreement.
Okay, and for just follow up for the appointment of the county exec, the joint appointment for that, How will that roll out? Will that be determined by the board specifically? How they would actually communicate to pick that individual
For the executive director position,
for that gubernatorial seat that
for the
is now?
for the
Yeah.
gubernatorial seat, my understanding is that the way this is envisioned is that the mayor would present a name and that the county executive would have to approve that seat. I'm sure that in addition to that conversation, there'd be preliminary conversations between the mayor and the county executive. And in addition to that, I'm sure that the county executive would have conversations with the council president to ensure that everyone was comfortable with that seat. But it would be a recommendation of the mayor that would need to be approved by the county executive.
Okay, so that's a little different than them picking it jointly together. That's kind of like a confirmation that so I'm just pointing
No,
out.
no,
that-
no, I understand. And I could be overstating that the recommendation of the mayor. I think the intent of the parties or the spirit of their agreement is that they would jointly pick someone. I think there's just the wording of it that it would be approved by the county executive. So,
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Councilman Miller, and then Councilwoman Stevens.
Mr. President, to Mr. Wobser, respectfully, the county executive and the mayor on Tuesday, I believe, at the meeting of the Planners Association, both openly endorsed the idea that the waterfront process should be an open and public process. And having one public meeting a year is not consistent with that. As for the ability for public comment to be received and considered, that's not going to happen easily if there's only one public meeting a year, and the one public meeting a year could easily be kind of a public relations showcase in which not much substantial business is considered, and so what I'm saying is that I have concerns over turning waterfront planning over to what can be processes done in secret, and what's being proposed here does not resolve those concerns, and I cannot support the legislation in the current form.
Councilwoman Stevens.
To the president.
Mr. President?
Yes.
I would request if Mr. Wobser could respond to the comments that I made.
certainly through the council president to Councilman Miller, what I would state is we did have conversations with the city of Cleveland, both before and after the event in which you speak. And while the statement is that the 501c3 would not necessarily be subject to public records or sunshine laws, is that the new community authority would be. And so any public authority, while this organization, like any nonprofit, has the ability to plan for its mission, it is not being given any of the powers that a public entity would have. And that if we did take the second step of adding the new community authority at that time, that would be bound by sunshine laws. And I think there was a push to make it as open as possible. And I think that the comfort level that the city had is what's reflected for the 501c3 as to the things that I presented today. And the hope is that knowing that a new community authority would be subject to Ohio sunshine laws would be enough to ensure that truly public business is conducted through the public records law. We do have an attorney representing the city, Kate Romanchuk. I don't know if she wants to distinguish any of that, if you'd like to come up and answer any specific questions from the councilman as to the city's position or clarification of this specific issue.
Good afternoon, everyone. Katie Romanchuk from Squire Patton Boggs on behalf of the city. through the council president. Just to clarify, the city would include in the cooperative agreement and in the draft that I believe you all have with you, that the NCDC board could determine after it is set up and organized and has started working, that it could adopt its own public records and public policy, public open meeting policies that it sees fit in its discretion that could be beneficial to the lakefront development project. So that's another addition to what Mr. Webster described as far as one annual public meeting, the public accounting annually, and I think the last one was public comment being received and considered.
So, Mr. President, I'm just going to say in the executive's defense that the executives seemed to me in discussions that we had to be willing to go farther than the city of Cleveland. This is the only shot I get on voting on this before it happens, and I'm not willing to just trust in what the board would do. So that's what my problem is. Thank you, Mr. President.
Councilwoman Stevens.
Mr. Webster, I didn't voice my comment at the public meeting, but I talked with Debbie Berry on your team, and I don't think this goes far enough. It focuses on one small area. We need a plan. I believe there's this guy by the name of Daniel Burnham that several folks in this town have heard of. He said, make no small plans, in essence. We have the opportunity here to begin planning from Lakewood to Euclid, and it's time for us to do that. I don't see a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. I get that we can't do everything simultaneously, but this isn't big enough for me. And it feels like a plan with one focus. I do see that you took out the stuff for the stadium, and this was the time to put in the bigger ideals. I'm also with my colleague, Mr. Miller, that when you don't make it public, that its written intent from the very beginning is to be public, there will people who will always hide behind the fact that that was not in the enabling legislation. And because of those two items, I'm, as the attorneys would say, I'm inclined to lean toward a no.
If I could, sorry. The council president to Councilwoman Stevens, the only thing I would state is to the larger vision or jurisdiction of the organization is that part of the reason that this specific jurisdiction is specific to the downtown lakefront is because the county, through its public works department alongside county planning, is leading planning of a lakefront plan from Lakewood to Euclid. In fact, a big piece of that, the East 9th through East 55th just received a nearly $25 million grant. And so our thought was there's a full-time staff person dedicated to the lakefront planning for the broader county within the Public Works Department, is that we feel like we can actually take a larger leadership role on the lakefront and the River Valley from within the county than specific to this, which we view as supporting the city's priority. And the reason that we're being asked to help fund this is because it's just such a complex part of it and includes not only the infrastructure but the development. So while your point is well taken, we do think, and the county executive is completely committed to a broad vision for the lakefront and the riverfront. And in fact, the county is playing a real leading role in that, both in the funding, securing funding, and planning for the lakefront outside of the jurisdiction of this organization.
All right, at this time, Councilman Pat Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Wobser, under the incorporation of the NCDC, the Board of Composition, it looks to me like the way it's worded that the professional sports team that's in that area could have up to 3 seats at the table. Would that be possible?
Through the council president, I believe it's only 1 seat, and 2 other seats would be lakefront stakeholders.
But it does say at least one,
At least one.
at least one. So the way it looks to me is it could be up to 3.
That's, I believe, not the intention, so we can go ahead and take a look at that, the wording there.
Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, this time, Councilwoman Sunny Simon.
Thank you. I appreciate that the line was drawn through the renovation of the Brown Stadium, but I want to ask the question whether there's any preclusion with this funding going forward, going toward the renovation of the Brown Stadium.
Through the council president to Councilwoman Simon, and Kate, if you want to jump in this anytime, go ahead. I don't think there'd be any issues on the county's end to ensuring that the county's funding as part of this agreement does not go towards Brown Stadium specific allocations. We'd have to obviously make that change, but the intent is that this is to go towards the support of the organization in planning for the connection and the redevelopment of the public space along the lakefront.
Okay, so my question is whether the organization itself would be precluded from funding the Brown Stadium just because you crossed out that sentence.
Through the council president to the councilwoman, I don't necessarily think that the organization is part of the process for the Brown Stadium. So I think that I don't think there'd be any issue in ensuring that this isn't going to be raising money that goes to the stadium. Although I can't speak for the city's intent on that. It's never been a part of the nearly 2-year planning process. It's always been a vision about this being the infrastructure side of the lakefront and not specific to the stadium. So I don't think it would be an issue for them to not use this as a mechanism by which they would fund stadium improvements.
I'm confused by that because the original presentation did include the Brown Stadium.
Through the council president, it is in the footprint, and that's why they're a stakeholder to this. But this is not a mechanism by which stadium improvements itself to the stadium.
Oh,
are
I
designed to be
understand
met.
that, but there's no preclusion from this cooperative entity from raising money to renovate the Brown Stadium.
I mean, I think there's also no authority to raise money to renovate the Brown Stadium that this.
Well, this is an early stage where we're forming something, and the something we're forming, the question I have is whether the something we're forming is precluded from raising money itself to renovate the Brown Stadium.
Anything legally in here that would prevent it from raising money, but the intent of this is not to raise money for the stadium.
I know what the, okay, thank you. I was told I need to not be disrespectful, so I apologize to anybody if that's how it came across last meeting. But this does refer to Exhibit A as the contemplated area which will be redeveloped. And when I turn to that exhibit, it clearly includes the Brown Stadium, correct?
If I may, through the council president, it does, because the areas around the stadium are part of the development project. There's the 10 acres just north of the stadium, but the stadium redevelopment project and the financing that's being handled by the city itself. The city will maintain control and have all negotiations with respect to the actual stadium redevelopment. But there is land around there that the city owns that is not to be used for stadium purposes, or maybe in the future will not, that would be under consideration for this lakefront development project because it abuts right there on the northern side.
And if I could, just briefly, I think a good analogy for this is that the Rock Hall, as the council members know, is embarking on a $94 million expansion project. That too is also within the footprint of the scope of this for planning purposes, but that project is not a part of this. I think Brown Stadium's future improvements would be similar in that that is a distinct and discrete project that we should be thinking about the planning happening alongside this and integrating that planning into this, but that project would happen separately, just as all the county property that sits in the south side of this agreement. Anything that we choose to do with our property is not impacted or a part of this in the same way that Brown Stadium wouldn't, but it does make sense to plan as if those things exist within the footprint.
Yeah, as I sit here, I cannot disconnect the Brown Stadium from that which you're asking us to form and be a part of with only 2 seats. So whatever this entity decides, we have really no say whether we like it or not. I mean, we have 2 seats at the table. If we don't like what the determination is by that body, we're bound by this agreement that's in front of us. And I'm not inclined to support this unless at some point it's very clear, separate it out, the Brown Stadium, out of this plan, out of this whole endeavor, because to me, this is just a way to market nicely a renovation of a sports stadium that the public would probably not be inclined to support. So I'm not going to support this because of that and because we only have 2 seats. But I do say that Debbie Berry is very talented, and I would support her continuing on with the work that was envisioned by the administration to add her knowledge and expertise to help plan this process, but not as a formal cooperative party to this agreement.
All right, at this time, Councilman Jack Schron.
Thank you. With council up there for the city, do you have any problem with having more than one open meeting?
Through the council president, that's a determination, I believe, for the NCDC board and a discussion with the city.
Do you perceive that to be an open forum when you have it once a year? Because my history always says when you have one of those kind of meetings, it's mainly perfunctory and they just come out with the big slides and show what was done in the year. They don't really look for an active interaction with the public and something like that if it's not done on a more regular basis. And I'm not asking you to tell me what the board would do, but when you only see something like that occurring one time in a year, does that strike you as being a broad-based public forum?
Through the council president, that's why we added the discretion of the board to adopt any additional open meeting policies that it sees fit after it is up and running and organized and starts working and sees what would benefit.
Discretion means it goes both ways. Our discretion is we don't want to have it. So it's within the discretion of our not wanting to have it. So that would still fall within the 4 corners of what I assume you had something to do with the drafting of this.
Through the council president, yes, I did. And
So you drafted it with a position that it could go both ways, in theory, the discretion.
through the council president in consultation with the city, yes.
Okay.
And if I may, through the council president, some of the other reasons the city, in consultation with some of the county representatives, as they described to them, would like to maintain the ability of the NCDC board to determine further open meeting and open records policies after it's up and running, is to avoid any unintended consequences by applying the Ohio Sunshine Laws whole cloth across the NCDC board. And in doing so, maybe limiting the partners and developers that would feel comfortable coming to the NCDC board and discussing their financial information, any trade secret
I'm
information.
sorry, but we all know that as attorneys, we know that if the Sunshine Law is involving a real estate transaction, that's exempt from the Sunshine Law, and you can do that in conference. So let's not try and pull that into negotiation for real estate or transactional activities. That is protected activity that you can have in executive session. So I don't want to cloud up that for the audience to think that somehow that you're going to negotiate a real estate transaction publicly. We understand that that's probably not going to take place in that respect. So our purpose here is a public body. And I raised it at the last meeting, that I'm offended that this is based upon real estate dirt, not based on real estate investment. And we have considerable amount of real estate investment. And as I've seen some of the preliminary plans, this land bridge that we're talking about is basically going to be 120 feet wide. Is that the correct number that I've heard? So somebody's already drafted an awful lot of this out there. Is that the correct number?
Through the council president, Councilman Schron, I don't know the exact specifics, but I do know the conceptual plan that was released last week. It sounds generally accurate. But
Yeah,
again,
that's basically,
a conceptual plan.
it's basically less than half the width of a football field. It's going to connect up our valuable real estate, of which we're going to just watch this whole thing unfold. I'm sorry, but it looks like there's an awful lot of things that have been done behind the scenes that are already planned and laid out by the city of Cleveland, of which we're not a participant, and we're going to get less and less of participant if this body votes this thing out. I mean, that's basically the width of this room. Just to put 120 feet into it, you can count the ceiling tiles if anybody wants to play around with that kind of game and figure out what it is. But it's not, we're connecting the biggest investment this county has into what is really envisioned, I think, as a connection to the football stadium for all intents and purposes.
Through the council president to the councilman, I do think.
Mr. Wobser, if you could speak directly into the microphone.
Oh, yeah, I'm
a little
sorry.
louder.
I do think the idea of creating a stronger connection to the lakefront, 120 feet, while as if viewed as land, is not very wide, but as far as a pedestrian bridge, it is a pretty big connection. There's also envisioned stronger connections to the lakefront from West 3rd Street and East 9th Street, so it's about forging a stronger connection between downtown and the lake. It is not specific for Brown Stadium, but certainly your points are well taken. The only other thing I would say is that while the public records request, in addition to the discretion of the board, there is a baseline that the city of Cleveland has agreed to hold those meetings. They could go above that, but they can't fall below it.
I mean, a baseline of 1. That's not,
Yeah.
that's not exactly what I call a baseline.
No, I agree, but it's a
minimal.
higher standard than none. And then in addition to that, though, as this body does begin to do public business through a new community authority, that would all be subject to the public records law. And I don't want to understate that the phase 2 of this is where more public decisions or traditional public authorities would be impacted, and that will all be subject to public records.
Have I missed it? Where's phase 2?
It is anticipated that we will come back to this body. Well,
So it's not written down there's not a phase 2 or phase 3 that we have.
Sorry, in my previous presentation, we discussed that is the intent that once this board is formed, that they will consider the creation of a new community authority. For any county property to be included in the new community authority, this council would have to agree to that. But under statute, if that new community authority is created, its actions are subject to public records law. And the only thing that would give this 501c3 any public authorities would be by virtue of the new community authority. A 501c3 by its nature doesn't have any public authority. Certainly, we'd be a funder of that organization, but we wouldn't be turning over any of the county's rights or responsibilities as a public body to that organization, unless we supported the creation of an NCA, which would be subject to public records at that time.
Thank you.
All right, at this time, Councilwoman Yvonne Conwell.
Mr. President, through to Mr. Wobser or Kate, I don't know who can answer the question, but in terms of, just was wondering, my mind thoughts, I was just thinking about the Port Authority and the seats that we have on the boards and commissions from here and from the Cleveland City side. Why wasn't it ever thought to be more inclusive with it's already a body that could do this? It's never been mentioned in any of the presentations or anything like that, why we wouldn't run through the Port Authority.
Through the council president to Councilman Conwell, in my previous presentation, I mentioned that the creation of this authority for lakefront redevelopment that had its sole mission to focus on this section of the lake was based on best practices from several other communities. I think Seattle, Cincinnati, and maybe St. Louis was the third entity. I think the idea of why the Port Authority wasn't the right entity for this is very similar to why the city of Cleveland isn't doing this directly, or that Cuyahoga County isn't doing this piece of it directly, is that when you look at the amount of infrastructure plus private development that would be taking place in a sort of concurrent path with the creation of that infrastructure, it is really a full-time job for an entity, and someone by best practice would be waking up every day that is only thinking about the many priorities that it takes to make that happen. The port has a lot of other responsibilities, and they've taken on additional responsibility, for example, in the Irish Town Bend project, as well as just running the Port Authority itself and pooling public financing for projects. I don't know that we would have gotten the level of priority from the Port Authority through that mechanism that you can get with a director or CEO with a strong board that is really driving this project for the next decade solely as their top priority and responsibility.
So it was given thought from both the city side or just the county side?
Through the council president to Councilwoman Conwell, there have been, I believe, 18 to 24 months of committee structure that the city, Greater Cleveland Partnership, the county administration's been a member on many task forces. County council's been invited to many of those task forces along the way, where all of this consideration. So while this is the beginning of one process, it is the culmination of a nearly 2-year process in which all of this was being considered, and both county council and the administration had opportunity to be a part of that process.
For which administration, like Armin's administration, because you guys haven't been
both
in office?
I think I was told it was about an 18-month total process. So roughly the first year of that would have been in the Budish administration, and then we picked up in the last 6 months upon the transition.
Well, I disagree that, the Port Authority is already set up and they do these kind of things and they extend it for the Irishtown Bend, and they're more apt to, and our current county executive, he sat on the Port Authority, so he's very aware that this could have been a possibility. So it seems like it's more and more of this idea for this lakefront nonprofit organization has been really probably led and developed by the city of Cleveland, and we're just playing catch up. That's just my feelings, but thank you for answering the question, because I wanted to know, at least make sure that you guys had thought about why we wouldn't use the Port Authority that's already established.
Right, at this time, Councilman Pat Kelly. Pat Kelly, you want to speak?
Thank you, Mr. President. I should ask this on my last question. This could have been answered a week ago. I don't remember. Why is the Cleveland Metro Parks not listed on this board?
Through the council president to Councilman Kelly, I don't know specifically why they're not designated, although I do know that the Metro Parks have been an active partner in planning this, and they've been represented on those committees. I know up until recently, Chief Barry was a Metro Park trustee. I don't know if she wants to speak in any more detail to that. I know she's in the audience today, but I've spoken to Brian Zimmerman, the director of the Metro Parks, as recently as last week, and they're a very active partner on the lakefront, and I would assume they'll be an active partner in this as well.
To Mr. Wobser, I'm sure they will be, but I think they should be on this board too. Have a seat, at least this one seat.
At this time, Councilman Marty Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eric, nice seeing you. Kate, how are you? How long have we been talking about redevelopment of the lakefront as a city and a county?
I don't know if that's hypothetical, but if not, through the council president to Councilman Sweeney, I believe the articles on that go back well over 100 years.
Got it. And this is then through the chair, this is the next iteration of trying to do something. Through the chair, can you tell me what you envision this board actually doing in the first 3 years? Just not too much detail so I can have a better comprehension of what the efforts would be to try to help maximize our most valuable lake.
Certainly. Through the chair to Councilman Sweeney, I think they're galvanizing the resources currently and getting the right partners around the table through the board to hire a staff. There's contemplation of hiring a CEO who can help
I got the
galvanize
staffing of it, but
resources, and then a finance and then a development person. But I think that there's a lot of complicated work that needs to be done with ODOT as to actually bridging from downtown, which I think has prevented a lot of the, there's been a lot of great work on the lakefront. We just haven't been able to make that strong connection. So I think they'll be helping overcome the obstacles to actually building a connecting bridge to the lakefront. They'll be preparing a development process by which publicly owned land that will likely continue to be publicly owned land can have some portions of it be privately developed. And then they'll be developing an opportunity for the incremental taxes that can be generated from that development to go towards actually the infrastructure and public space improvements, and really just kind of coordinating all the efforts to bring the lakefront to life. But I think, to your point, we have worked hard at this through a variety of bodies over 100 years. But when we took a hard look at communities, because having highways and railroad tracks separating waterfronts from downtowns, sadly, is not uncommon throughout the country. I think this committee, through its work, went out and found the communities that have been able to actually achieve making that connection and did it well. And we're building the best model we can for the Cleveland area and Cuyahoga County as to how to do it. And this entity is thought to be that best practice come to life so that an entity can be focused full-time on planning for that infrastructure, financing that infrastructure, galvanizing local, state, federal, and private resources in one place, and then ultimately bringing on private development partners to develop the appropriate portions of this for private development, the creation of that development, providing an opportunity and new revenue to help be a part of that financing structure.
Thank you very much for the details. So basically, the first step is access from their planning process. The second step is, what are we going to do to make the immediate from the river to 55th? Is that would that be the first step, or that's up to them to decide?
Through the council president, I think the connection to the lake is the first critical step. There is the secondary zone, which is a longer term of looking east towards Burke. And in conversations with the mayor's staff, et cetera, they do view, as they're making progress in this, the ability to expand east and west. But I think the first piece is get that focal point done, and then expand from there. And again, very actively, the county, the Metro Parks, the Mandel Foundation are working to make those connections to east to Gordon Park and west to Lakewood and beyond. But this specific set of infrastructure with the rail and the highway passing through the downtown is so complex that this organization is set up to solve that challenge and to open up opportunity for the public space improvements and development along the lake. Yeah.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, to the presenter. So this is best practices is a good thing to go out and look at for this snapshot of time, right? Because it's 2023. Back in the earlier days, it was something different, and you looked and found this as the way to do it. With this board being recommended to this council in the fashion it is, how, if we don't take action on it, what's your opinion on the success of the board being as productive as it could without the county's participation?
Through the council president to Councilman Sweeney, well, it's hard to predict the future. I think the goal of the creation of this entity is to get the right stakeholders around the table. While it is City of Cleveland land and City of Cleveland infrastructure and development, it is at the center of Cuyahoga County, and I think that the county has been an important partner, as Councilman Gallagher expressed many, many times, and certainly it needs to continue to make sure that work is done throughout the county. But I think we've been an important, when things have worked here through cooperation between governments or cooperation between the public and private sector, the county has been a really meaningful player in all that. And I think this will take some county participation through the leadership of this council and the executive to make sure that this initiative is successful overall.
And through the church, it would maximize the potential for success.
Absolutely.
Thank you for recognizing the county's significance as a governing body. This is the second time you're coming up. We're going on recess. It seems to be somewhat times sooner than later. Would that be accurate through the chair?
Yes, sir.
And are we going to come back again with some of the strong recommendations from these of my colleagues to see if we can keep going, or is it at some point we're just going to say we gave it our best shot and the council and this administrator or the council wasn't satisfied? Was there some kind of drop dead date?
Through the council president, obviously there's a sense of urgency for a variety of reasons, but and while we'd like to continue to move forward and made the efforts that we made with the city to get it
to where it's at now,
was in an effort to do that, but you know, we want to stay at the table with council and get this done, and anything that takes 100 years to do is worth doing the right way. So, you know, we want to keep working with you guys, although we also want to get moving, you know, because it has been talked about for a while, and I think we have a unique opportunity to move it forward.
Yeah, and I'll wind up with, it's, in my eyes, necessary that the county, both through the council president and our administration, or our executive, have a significant role. Those two seats, they can have, they're strong voices, and I know they'll be respected, and being the part of the process is just going to add tremendous value because that's the leadership that we have right now. So thank you, Mr. President.
I'm Councilman Gallagher.
To piggyback on Councilman Kelly, I received, and I think council received a letter from the administrative judge in a probate court requesting strongly a seat on the board for the Metro Parks. It's probably wise to listen to the administrative judge in the probate court. I really do applaud the young visionary leadership that we have, not just here in the county, but the city of Cleveland. But you're hearing hesitancy on our part. And I think it goes to, again, the amount of seats. And we're obviously a junior partner in this and being treated as a junior partner with those votes. And I always wonder, is this fair? Is it equitable for the county to get involved with this situation? And I always try and put myself in the other person's shoes. Would Cleveland change places with us as the amount of board seats? My guess is no. So that tells me even more that this is a Cleveland-driven plan and that Bay Village, Rocky River, Lakewood, Euclid, and Bracknell are being left out of this, which is the broad vision of the lake. So if it's more going to be driven by Cleveland, then let's be honest about it. And then the amount of seats really don't matter. Then it comes down to cost. So if we were to move forward as it exists right now, the only thing that I would insist on is that our financial input be commensurate with the amount of seats that we have and not to go above and beyond. And so that would be a sticking point for me. The rest of it, I really don't have a problem with. Personally, and this is just me saying it, the Brown Stadium's a piece of garbage. It was horribly done, horribly designed, horribly placed, and that's nobody in this room's problem. They need a new stadium somewhere else, not on the lakefront. I worked 30 years in the courthouse, and when the old gray lady came down, I can't even tell you how breathtaking the vision was, the vista was from the courthouse to the lake. And then to watch that thing come out of nowhere and take that view away was just heartbreaking, knowing what possibly could have been put there. And the problems on the lake go back historically 100 years. People thought Stinchcomb was crazy, but now we have the Metro Parks because of him. So I applaud the vision of our young leadership, and I want to get behind it. But if we're going to be stuck with a minority amount of seats, then I want to make it very clear, then we'll be putting in a minority amount of money. And if that's okay, and my colleagues are okay with that, then we can move forward. But as you can see, there's hesitancy here. But I understand the importance of the lake. When the Republican convention was here, and I think I've said it before, everybody was from out of town. We were at the Rock Hall. The sun was going down. The city was lit up. The city was vibrant. And every visitor from all over the United States and the world, when they found out I was from Cleveland, couldn't gush more about the ocean. They didn't call it a lake. They all called it an ocean. We don't know what we have here. So I agree. It's about time we move, but planning is important, and it seems there's been flaws in this planning.
All right, at this time, Councilwoman Meredith Turner.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. So I've been listening to my colleagues, and they have communicated my thoughts probably better than I ever could. I did have some concerns about the fairness and, this plan being equitable from the county. I also attended the planning meeting last week, and one thing that kind of sticks out in my mind is the mayor talking about his experience as a young boy and having access to the lake. And as a young college student in Chicago, I was just amazed by Navy Pier and was just wondering, what are we doing, back home? I was just in Indianapolis last week, and they have about 6 hotels attached to their convention center. So I'm excited, about development on the lake. I think it's well overdue. I think we really need to do it well if we're going to do it. And I can think of some other things that are more urgent, to my colleague Sweeney's point. But here we are, nevertheless. We do need to move forward. I have a question from someone watching who wanted to know when members of the public submit their public comments to this new entity, how will members of the public be able to read and hear other public comments that have been submitted?
Through the council president to Councilwoman Turner, while I can't speak specifically to that, I think that is something that the new board, through the website, social media posting, sharing with partners like the city and county who have a large bandwidth, I think that in making the commitment to ensure that that is reflected, I think they can roll up their sleeves and figure out a way working through themselves and partners to do it. If you need more specifics, we can look into that between now and the next conversation on this. But I think there are ways to do that well with the platforms that we have available to us.
And just in conclusion, my biggest concerns are around transparency of process. I don't want the people that this should benefit the most to be excluded from this process. We are the freshwater capital, right? Our biggest asset. If we're going to do this, we need to do it big, as Vice President said, and do it right. Thank you, Chairman.
So Eric, you've heard from this council. There has been quite a bit of constructive information. Do you find any value in all that you've heard from this council?
Yes, through the council president to the council, we really appreciate this feedback. I think there's a commitment from the county executive to work with council and to get this done. I leave it to the council as if you're in a position to support this today, but if you're not, rather than vote negatively on this, we'd prefer to keep working behind the scenes and figure out if there's some more changes that can be made that create a stronger comfort level to get this through. But we just want to make sure that we're able to keep having those conversations in a timely sense because, especially as Councilman Sweeney said, going into recess, et cetera, one meeting can easily become a few months based on the calendar. But that being said, we'd much rather find a way to get this done than to see it not happen with the county support.
All right, we will give you that time. All right.
Thank you.
We will hold this item in committee of the whole.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
At this time, we will move on to our next item. Madam Clerk.
Resolution 2023-0182, authorizing a real estate purchase agreement with Craig Realty Group, Cleveland LLC, or its designee, in an amount not to exceed $38,703,000 for the purchase of certain parcels of real property in Garfield Heights, Ohio, with access to Granger Road, totaling approximately 72.1 acres, now known as permanent parcel numbers 542-14-004, 542-15-002, and 542-22-022, and a portion of permanent parcel number 542-14-002. And Council President, since these are related, may I read the other two items consecutively into the record as well?
Yes.
Ordinance number 2023-0012, amending and codifying Board of County Commissioners Resolution number 2007-07-3101, dated July 26, 2007, and enacting new Chapter 727, Section 727.01 of the Cuyahoga County Code to change the period of time during which the county sales tax shall be levied at the aggregate rate of 1 1/4%. Ordinance 2023-0013, amending and codifying Board of County Commissioners Resolution number 2007-07-3102, dated July 26, 2007, and enacting new Chapter 727, Section 727.02 of the Cuyahoga County Code to change the period of time during which the county use tax shall be levied at the aggregate rate of 1 1/4%.
All right. At this time, the administration may present.
Good afternoon, Council President. Mike Chambers, Fiscal Officer, here to basically continue our conversation that we've been having the last couple of weeks. We do have a few slides to go over with you. No, Mike.
Well, we can ad lib a little. Oh, okay, very good. This first slide is a result of a question that council had asked of our financial advisor, which we sent to all of council, I believe it was last week. I emailed all of you. I just cut out the top half for discussion purposes. The request was to look at a 30, 35, and a 40-year term, what the amount needed from the general fund, and how much annual debt service would be tied to that we would need. You know, looking at it theoretically, and what we've always said from day one is we will come back once we have a total and complete project of what we're doing, not only with the jail, but with the courts. So looking at this in theory, it doesn't look like a big deal. But remember, we've always said that going with a 40-year provides us the maximum flexibility. And with that, I'd like to throw onto this next slide, which was a result of our conversation last time. You know, how much money would we in fact take in over the life term? So let's take a look at the first one. There's the 40-year term. The top is what we're recommending is based on a 2% growth factor, which we feel is firm. It's a good number, not only for a long-term 40-year growth, but also for bond counsel and for, you know, financial planning. Based on this, we would collect about $3.4 billion with this extension. The total jail debt service would be $1.8 billion. Residual value will be about $1.5 billion. And what that means is it would leave about $485 million left over after the jail present value to fund a court proposal. If you look at the one directly below that, it just assumes a zero growth factor, which we know, you know, is not, you know, the case. And the bottom line is it would need enough cash to fund $190 million. Going with the 30-year, and once again, from the first slide we showed, it doesn't seem that significant. But when you look at the 30-year with the 2% growth rate factor, collect $2.2 billion. Debt services, yes, less, $1.4 billion. Leaves over 785 residual, but that translates to a present value of $305 million. So those are the reasons why we asked from the very beginning to go with a 40-year. It gives us the maximum flexibility. But we did state once we have a true picture of everything, we would come back and maybe a 35-year is the recommendation, at which time council can then amend the legislation down to match that. Other than that, those are a couple things that we followed up on, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Councilman Tuma.
Hey, thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Chambers, I appreciate you taking the time or having bond counsel go through these terms. So could you just explain again why we don't have a comparison of the 40 and the 35 like you did the 40 and 30?
We could. I mean, what I've said all along is I think the result is somewhere in the middle. I was just sharing with you, and I can certainly get that. That's not a big deal, but.
Well, the only reason I ask is because looking at the 40 and the 35, it does not seem to be that much of a financial difference where the 40 and 30 seems to be difficult to do.
Yeah, and remember, it's not even, you can't just take half and do, I mean, it's time of money and everything. So the point being was with the 30-year, which was on the slide, and I can come back with the 35-year. I wasn't trying to be coy. I was just trying to show you the extremes of both end. But I was also trying to tell you we may settle on a 37-year or a 33. It all depends once we get to that final, you know, the RFP back. Once we get the final jail cost, we'll come back, we'll have better information. I was only stressing that 40-year continues to give us the most flexibility of any of the plans. But I'll certainly get that for you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Councilman Strawn.
So just looking at your slides, and I appreciate you getting those totals for us. I think it was one of the ones that was asking for that. So what we're looking at is the taxpayers on slide 30-year versus taxpayer slide 40 save $2.2 billion. Is that, or I mean $1.2 billion?
Yeah, from 3.4 down to 2.2.
Yeah, so the taxpayers are not going to be paying to the county 2.4 or $1.2 billion. And all that we're giving up is the differential between $485 million, and so we're giving up $180 million, for the taxpayers to receive a benefit of 1.2 billion? Am I understanding correctly, your numbers?
Once again, there was a comment made at the last meeting that we would not have money left over. Once again,
Don't give me all the other,
No, no,
I'm not looking for the
oh, I'm sorry,
explanation.
yeah.
I'm just trying to get to the numbers.
Yeah.
Is that's
Correct.
So for a delta of $180 million, the taxpayers receive a $1.2 billion benefit.
That is correct. Looking
Okay.
at, once again, the
Well,
extreme
I'm just
end.
looking at your
Yeah,
numbers. I'm
yeah.
not, not trying to do anything else. So in order to come, if we came up with an additional, some way of finding, and I'm not sure what the analysis is, $180 million, we've just transferred over $1 billion benefit back to the taxpayers.
I mean, that's true, Councilman, yes.
Thank you.
Further questions? If not, were there additional presenters from the administration?
My name is Ryan Jeffers. I'm with CBRE, the real estate consultant to the county. Are we able to pull up the next slide in the presentation? There we go. So thank you for having us here again this week. There were a couple of questions that were asked last week that we wanted to make sure to come back to you and address and go through. So we're going to start with this slide. Councilman Schron, you had asked a question about the timeline for the seller and their acquisition of the property originally. And there were two parts of it, so I was actually going to talk about Councilwoman Conwell as well. But there was one question about the timeline, and there was one question about the investment. So I wanted to address both to come back to you on this. So I'll start with the timeline. The answer that we gave last week, and we specifically gave the answer that the final acquisition happened in 2019. That was something that we knew in the moment, but we wanted to go back and make sure that we had the balance of the timeline lined up, because a lot of this is public record for various reasons, and so we can just kind of walk through it here with you. If you look on the screen, you'll actually see the site as it looked 20 years ago. It's a very different looking property. There's residential subdivisions on it. There's commercial buildings on it that don't exist today. 20 years ago is actually when this assemblage began. And this is the story of an assemblage. So for large, interesting properties in our area, assemblages, they just take time. And so this is a little bit of the narrative of that. So in 2003, 20 years ago, the site included commercial lands, office buildings with existing tenants, all low-rise, some residential that you see, numerous roadways and utilities, and a fair amount of, wooded area and green space on the site. Now I seem to be having, there we go. That was when the assemblage began, and this was not by the current owner. So that assemblage began about 20 years ago. After a few years, this is now what the site looks like from overhead. So in 2006, once the residential groups and individuals had been acquired, site work really begins. You can see a dramatic change in what the property looks like. There's demolition that's happening, there's site work that's happening, there's infrastructure that's happening. Initially, and many of you may remember this, this was going to be called Bridgeview Crossing. This was going to be a retail center that was going to be, somewhat comparable to City View that happened on the south side, although on a very different piece of real estate. So a lot of that investment began in 2006, and as we all know, just the misfortune of timing, a year and a half later, the financial crisis hits. You have commitments at that time by tenants like Target and Lowe's and Aldi. In fact, the Aldi building is the property you see on the north side that's up along Granger there. You have commitments at the time by all of those groups, but unfortunately in the financial crisis, you start to see a lot of litigation, a lot of commitments that aren't being met, and a lot of lawsuits, litigation that gets launched. That unfortunately for this site leads to roughly a decade of various legal matters that really tied it up and left it sitting there with two half-built buildings. In 2010, the current owner, the proposed seller, if this were to be approved, the current owner emerges in an entity called Garfield Hope. Garfield Hope was Craig Realty. It was a strategic investor on the West Coast who saw the opportunity emerging here and decided to come in and acquired. Their first acquisition was actually not ground. It was the debt from Huntington Bank that was on the property. That was their first acquisition. In 2011, because of all the legal issues, a receiver is appointed. That receiver has their assignment for roughly 6 or so years. And over that time, there are legal battles. There are a lot of consultants. There are a lot of attorneys who are debating this. There are some acquisitions by that Garfield Hope entity of additional property. The last piece on transportation is acquired in 2014. And ultimately, in 2017, the receiver is released. The Garfield Hope entity gets transfer of title on the other properties, but the litigation still actually continues for a couple of more years, goes until 2019. And then the final title changes that we mentioned, last week, those happen in 2019 to really collapse parcels underneath and to, put the entities on it in a uniform manner. And unfortunately, for this site, then what happens? 2020 happens. In the last 3 years, they did an acquisition on East 96. That was the last piece that was acquired. They continued to do demolition and make investment, but then the pandemic hit. And thus, here we are today with a site that has a little bit of, infrastructure on it, some half-built buildings, and that has not been fully developed. So I wanted to make sure to run through that. It was a question that you had asked. And then the corresponding question that was asked by Councilwoman Conwell had to do with the investment that was made. There we go. So as an assemblage, this isn't a simple matter of going through on the county recorder site, as even I often do when I'm looking through these sorts of matters and seeing what was spent to acquire different parcels. The truth is that the vast majority of this was acquired by the acquisition of 2 tranches of debt through Huntington Bank that were worth roughly $35 million that had been run up in the property acquisitions and the work that had been done to date by the prior developer. Mechanics liens existed at the time. Those had to be dealt with during the litigation. Those were just north of $9 million. The 2 property sales we talked about on transportation and East 96th, those are one is recorded, one is actually getting corrected in the recorder's site. Those are about $5.2 million. And then there has been additional demolition and infrastructure that was invested since that time that was not part of that mechanics lien of about $7 million. So what you find is that, again, this is the story of an assemblage. They're not always easy. They take years and years and years. And significant dollars can be invested there that are not necessarily always seen. Some of this is in the public record, by the way, because of the litigation. So you can go and you can identify some of these amounts. Some of the things like the demolition and the infrastructure, those aren't recorded because it's work and investments that they made. So knowing the scope of the work, we looked at it and we feel that's probably a pretty reasonable assumption for that estimate. But I guess the big picture here is that this is a significant investment, and it's not an investment that was made a couple of years ago that turned into a flip. This is an investment that has come over time, over a 20-year window. So a pretty significant and strategic effort by the buyer. There's one other thing, Councilman Kelly, you had asked the question, and it was something that we had addressed with a couple of the council people. And I will acknowledge that I wanted to make sure to address this, but I wanted to make sure to address this in the right way. Your question, Councilman, had to do with, at a future point in time, we didn't give a year, but at a future point in time, what would this property be worth? It's very hard to project, right? It's very hard to know with certainty what values, especially in real estate, will be. But what we can tell you is that the retailers and the commercial users who have been pursuing this property over the course of, call it 17 years, because those transactions that were to happen but ended up defaulting were really fomenting in 2006. Those transactions were anywhere in the range of $300,000 an acre to $1 million an acre. Those are significant numbers. At the high end, we are beyond admittedly what many think about as the commercial average, but these are what some of these retailers were willing to invest based upon the site and based upon what they had seen there at different times. But unfortunately, financial crisis, litigation, pandemic, a lot of retailers have then changed their models. So those projects did not yet come to be. I'll pause there. I wanted to make sure, again, to address the questions. And are there, from last week, and then are there any questions that you have now?
Councilman Strawn?
Just more from an economic or financing aspect. Huntington Bank did not discount that $35 million to get it off their debt. I mean, I'm shocked that if I got somebody who's willing to take my debt, man, it's yours for a lot less than the full face value of the debt.
So it's a good question. I figured that that would come up. Unfortunately, Huntington won't answer that. The seller won't answer that because they're under an NDA. We believe it was discounted. We believe it was discounted. Now, as you know, debt, when it's sold on the secondhand market, sometimes even beyond that, is going to go at a discount. Is it going to go at a 5% discount? Maybe 10. But is it going to?
Or maybe higher.
But is it, hold on, but is it going to be slashed more than half off? Not in my experience.
Okay.
So even in today's distressed market where we are seeing the risk of bank default in America in the next 2 years be unprecedented, we are still not seeing debt trade in the secondary market below the 50% threshold. So if you take those numbers and you discount that debt in half, you still end up with a strategic investment of $40 million over that time.
I'm trying to get to a number that equates to what they're willing to sell it
That's
to
right.
us for.
And so, and I wanted.
That makes sense then.
I want to be transparent that those aren't publicly available figures, but I have to believe that it was discounted. I have to believe it was significantly. But even if I give it a 50% discount, you still find a $40 million investment over a 20-year window.
Okay. But I just want to make sure this body understood that they probably did not pay $35 million for $35 million worth of debt.
Agreed.
So I just, in fairness, I'm getting all the facts out there. Thank you.
At this time, Councilwoman Conwell.
Okay, just going back to the, I guess, the questions through the chair. What did City View, because you mentioned City View was on the other side, and what is this Garfield proposed side?
It used to be called Bridgeview Crossing.
Bridgeview, okay.
Yeah, it's no longer known by that name.
So just trying to connect the dots. What year do you know what year City View had to close? And was the current owner of this that we're dealing with now, was he an owner or a partial owner of the City View property?
So I don't know the exact year the City View closed. I apologize. I have a sense of it in my head, but I don't know.
2008, my staff texted.
2008, there you go. And actually, it never fully closed. Giant Eagle kept operating on that site. So there are elements of it that kept going. The ownership of Bridgeview Crossing, both past and current, was not a part of City View. That was a different group. And now City View has since transacted and sold to a different developer.
Okay, do you know the cost of the cleanup that it took just for on this Bridgeview, whatever portion? You talked about the demolition and the acquisition and everything that occurred, but I'm just, because that land out there, all of it was kind of messed up. Where did the actual cleanup, environmental, start to occur? Or did it
Are we talking on Bridgeview on the north?
Yes, we're talking about the site for today.
There wasn't environmental cleanup necessary. There was demolition, and so by the nature of demolition, there had to be cleanup of materials. It has to be expected that in some of the buildings there may have been asbestos, but we don't know anything about the asbestos specifically. We know that all of the phase ones that have been done on the property by the prior and current developers have come back, suggesting no other need for phase 2 testing. There were no industrial or polluting uses on this site previously. As you saw in the one picture, it was residential, it was green space, and it was commercial office.
And I'm glad you brought that up because it was a question I left at home. Why wasn't there, if you could just go over again, you might have stated it before, why is this property not being considered, or this land, for a phase 2 cleanup? Because we of the use, the potential use that we want to go forward. You know, different people's lives are at stake. So you might have mentioned it previous in your, but most others have required us to do a phase 1 environmental and a phase 2. So
So a phase 1 environmental, if it reveals historical uses that would have polluted the property, drive you to conduct a phase 2 testing, can be all sorts of things in a phase 2 testing, and potential remediation. Phase 1s on this property come back clean. So there's no need for doing an environmental remediation on the site.
and who determines that?
So consultants, environmental consultants have been hired over the years who have conducted those studies. And all of that material is in possession of the seller who had provided them to your public works team and the consultants over the last year or so. Actually, more than that, because they originally proposed on this about 18 months ago.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilman Miller.
Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Jeffers, I see the land listed as 39 million, and it's also listed about the same in the legislation. But I've also heard the number 52 million. Can you tell me where that would have come from?
So the proposed price of the property is 38.703 million in the legislation. I'm not sure where a $52 million came from. Are you talking about the investment figures that we put on the screen before? Are you talking at a previous time?
I'm talking about in the past, I had heard 52 million as the total land cost, and or am I mistaken?
So, sorry, the only thing I can think of, and I'm not sure, is that may have at one point, I genuinely do not know, that may have at one point been a part of the negotiation process, but that is never a number that was settled on or proposed that I am aware of.
Okay. In the last slide that you had up on the screen, it says construction inflation rate 27.5%. That,
Oh, I believe that might be the next slide, Councilman. Is that? I'm happy to let Mr. Applebaum come up. I just don't want to depart from this if there are other questions.
okay.
Okay.
All right, any further questions? No? All right, we'll have our next presenter.
Good afternoon, Jeff Applebaum with Project Management Consultants. I apologize that I was not here last week, but I do understand there were some questions that came up both about cost and schedule, so I'll just briefly address those. First of all, at this point in time, there is a budget number that we are utilizing to move forward on, and once again, it's a budget. Budgets, as you get into design, as you learn more information, they can change, but it is a budget. And I just want to make a couple comments about how this budget was derived. So if you start out, and this is consistent with what I think I said the last two times I was here, if you start out with where we were last October, obviously a different site, but the elements of the project were the same in terms of the basic correction center, sheriff's administration. If you simply took that number, which as you know was 750, which included property, if you took the part that was subject to escalation, and that would not have included the property, but conservatively, it would have approached, it would be a part of that number. Let's just say conservatively it was $700 million. It'd probably be a little less because the property wasn't there. I told you last time that the annual, that we're probably looking at a 1-year impact from where we were to when we start, probably about a year, give or take. The inflation rate for construction since last year, as I told you before, was just around 5%. So if you took that $700 million at around 5%, add $35 million, so you would have gone from maybe 750 to 785 or so if you simply took that number. Now, there are some things which are different that do represent opportunities for savings from the last budget. The principal one was the removal of structured parking. On the budget within it did have structured parking, around $15.4 million. Now, we do have the opportunity with this site to forego structured parking and have surface parking. Some of it will be covered, but it will not be structured. It will not be a multi-level parking structure. So that's a savings of about $15.4 million. We do have some savings over the presumption that was in the 750. The 750 actually had two numbers involving structure. One of them, which was up in the land cost, which is removed, but even beyond that, there was about $2 million of geotechnical structural support. We don't need those foundations. That's about a $2 million savings. The only other thing, which is a small number, but when we got to the 750, we were looking at the combined inflation rates through COVID of the prior years. The actual rate from the original budget estimate to the 750, it was 27.5%. We were using around 20.28. There's a slight savings there. But the bottom line is there's probably about 20 million, a little bit more than 20 million that would come off of that 38. So the 750, probably equates to around 770 or so. But once again, we create the budget at 750. We work toward that budget. We look for opportunities for additional savings. This shows you how it is laid out. Essentially, we now know the land cost would be 39. We have equivalent to the last time what would be the correction center hard cost itself, what would be the sheriff's administration component, the site work, and this is not environmental, this is just the normal site work, moving dirt, putting the site in the shape to accommodate the building, IT systems, and then the other components, FF&E, furniture, fixture, and equipment, owner supplied equipment, consulting fees, both outside of the design build cost. That would be all the soft costs for the HOKs, geotechnical. It also has soft costs, which are within the design build. Those are all the architects, engineers, and consulting fees. We still do have an owner's contingency of $40 million. Now, that'll get spent because, once again, we have a series of things that we will know in design. Comes up to 750. That's a budget. Could it be more? Yes. Can we work to that budget honestly and effectively? Yes. How does it equate to the last budget you saw last October? It equates probably, it's probably cutting it by about $20 million in a way that we don't yet know all of the ways that we'll get it. But once again, we do this on every project. We get a budget. We work through it. I think Mr. Schron, or Councilman Schron, you talked a little bit about understanding that process. There's a lot of unknowns, but it is a reasonable and responsible budget. It is not overly conservative. It is not a guarantee, but it is a responsible budget. And I can answer some questions about that if you have them, but I was going to go on to the next slide, which talks about schedule and how that relates to this. And then we could talk about both of these together. Oh, I'm sorry, it's up there. So what you see now, and you may recall, because over the last several years, I have the same picture And Councilman Gallagher will remember that in our steering committee meetings and in meetings before you, I've had this very simple diagram, at least the green part at first. And what this demonstrates is, obviously we started it up. We went through a very long programming and project definition session, which was everything we did with the steering committee. We got to the point of plan acceptance, project delivery determination, and we started into the conceptual design phase. Of course, that was still when we were thinking of doing this at Transport Road. We went as far as we could in concept design until it became site-specific, which is now. We are now where that red line is that says develop finance plan. What would occur if we are able to move forward and have enough confidence that we know the site, we would re-engage with our design team and our other consultants. We'd have to, have further geotechnical exploration done at this point in time for actual foundation work. We would have to go back, reconfirm the program on this site, which is a few months, launch back into the rest of schematic design, move on to design development, all the phases. But what this tells you is that, and then we would have to get our design builder selected. Well, not selected, but under contract. We have our design builder selected. You may recall that we were pretty far along with that process, but we didn't get to execute the contract in October. We have to get all those parties back on board. The bottom line is that from the point that we are able to start, it'll be a few months for to get everyone on board, project confirmation, a few months to complete schematic design, get schematic design estimates, reconcile that, launch into design development. In about 6 months from now, if we start now, we'll be at a point, 6 to 8 months, we'll be at a point when we'll have actual construction cost estimates based on actual design on an actual site. We'll have enough information that we'll really know where we stand cost-wise. We'll obviously do reconciliation. We'll be working with the state to make sure the state is confident in the programming we've done. But we'll have confidence knowing where we stand in 6 to 8 months and the remaining work we have to do to get the project either within a budget or to talk about if that budget has to be revised at all. We will be to a GMP in 12 months. 12 to 14 months if we start now, at which point in time we would have to issue bonds to continue on with the construction phase, and the construction for a project like this would probably be 30 to 36 months. So that would be the timeline. So, and then once substantial completion occurs, you'd have a couple to 3 months of move-in. So that would be the plan moving forward if we could actually commence that process. The only other point I will make about this, there are still two things that this depends upon. One of the things, this still does assume a population in the jail. I haven't looked at, I don't know where the jail population was in the last couple weeks, but we still are above, a little bit above, keep in mind that 15% factor we've talked about. We still probably have to do further population reduction to get to the program we're talking about. If we don't, the cost could be a little bit more if we have more units. If we do, it could be a little less, but we're still assuming 1,904 beds as part of this program, and that's a variable. We'll have still several months before we have to confirm that. And also, we still have to go back and, work with the state on process. But that's really a summary of, the cost assumption for the project and the schedule assumption for the project.
Have you calculated, Jeff, the additional cost for if the bid number does rise on us from 1,900 to, what are you speculating at?
Well, there's a generic number. If you went back to the outset, if you just want to use a rough number to fill in, there's a kind of an all-in presumption of a number that is slightly under, it's a little bit under $300,000 per bed. So it's probably about 10 or 15% less than that, but somewhere between 270, 280 per bed. So if you had to add 100 beds, you could do the calculation. Now, keep in mind, though, you can't just add separate beds. You have to, these are done in housing units. So you can't just add one bed. If you get to a threshold, and it depends on where your numbers are off, you may have to add a type of housing unit. So depending on where you are, if you're really off and have to add a whole nother unit for a special population, because we are off and we're not getting our population done, whether it's male, female, medical, or different designations, you could have to add housing units. And my only point is, it is in everyone's best interest to continue to try to drive every aspect of jail population down. I've been saying this for 3 years or 4 years, and that doesn't change. It's still critical to the process.
Councilman Strawn.
Thank you. Mr. Avalon, you worked on a number of projects on behalf of the county?
Yes,
I
sir.
believe. And do you have an idea of how many of those you have, just roughly, so that for benefit of the audience?
With the current
Exception of the current project.
Yeah, well, we did the convention center, the jail. I worked for you guys on part of your administration building project. Prior to that, it goes all the way back to doing things like, it wasn't just the county, but, Gateway, Stadium, Arena, projects like that.
Okay. Just the ones that you did directly for the county during our tenure, how about that? I'll just keep it to that. What percentage or dollar amount of savings from the GMP, in those GMPs, you think we were able to achieve? Because I know
I'm sorry,
the GMP is going to eventually come in with a number. It's going to say, this is the price of the project. And then, at least as I recall, we were able to drive savings in that project through cost savings, of which came out to dollars and percentage, which I remember somebody put those into a certain building that I was not necessarily in favor of out there. But do you remember what those dollars amount?
But if I
those
give you the
percentages were?
answer, are you going to commit me to the same savings?
No,
on this
just
project?
Get back of the envelope as far as information.
We have, let me say it this way. What we have done on these projects is we have set up a contingency that we anticipated using, and the contingency on top of that if we had to use, we'd use. We have not used let's say the super contingency. So I would say from the overall top number, we've usually been able to, save in the vicinity of 5 to 10% or of that number, something like that. I haven't really gone back.
And that's what I recall roughly in that range. So if you were able to achieve that, and I know we don't have a GMP right now for a justice center, but we do have one, potentially it's going to be in this range. Let's hope it is. And if the Justice Center comes in at at a $500 million number, I'm just picking out a number, not holding anybody to it. If we get that the same GMP, we're going to throw off probably about $100 million in savings between those two.
Can I
plus?
I have to make a comment though about this, because we have to be careful. And let me there's a couple things that are different about this project, and let me say what they are. Okay, number one, when you do a hotel or a convention center or an office building, you have the ability to do certain things that are creative. You have the ability to redesign, to do some things in different ways. You have less flexibility on a jail, because on a jail, there are, the way a jail is done, there are constraints, there's things you must do. It's not like you can add a lot of aesthetic features that you're taking out. So I just have to caution you that there's less ability to manage in a budget on a jail, because so much is compelled by the state, so much has to be there, and there's some limitations. We expect to be successful with this. We expect to manage the budget successfully, but it is different. I don't want expectations to be unreasonable. I'm giving you a reasonable budget, which I believe, and I think we can achieve this budget, but it's not easy to do this with this kind of project. So I don't want to be I don't want to act like this is overly conservative.
I I can only speak for myself, but I, for one, believe that we could have done a better job with our juvenile justice building with what we put into that facility and the cost that we did, that with some overlook and oversight, we could have certainly saved a lot of money. And I'm not asking, that was not your project, but you certainly saw what we built there.
I did review what happened on that project. I actually think there was a report, Councilman Gallagher, you were part of, and I read it. A lot of the things that did not work successfully on that project are things that we have, the project delivery method is different, and there's a lot of controls that I think would avoid that kind of result. That was a different type of project, a different type of delivery, and I think we can avoid all of that on this project.
And I understand the jail is going to have some mandatory constraints in it, but when you start looking at our Justice Center, you start looking at the Sheriff's Department that we're putting in, those are areas where you think you do have maybe not quite the same flexibility as a hotel, but you're not bound by mandatory requirements like you do in the jail.
Yes, but the point is, we're going to have a very robust planning process. The difference between this project and maybe that project and all the other projects that we've been involved in together now, this council, is that it's the front-end planning. It's so much time and effort to plan it and to go through these steps before you get to the GMP and to actually get your guaranteed maximum price using the methodology that we're talking about.
Well, if you can tell from my questions, I'm trying to get to $180 million savings. That's the difference between the 30-year and the 40-year. Thank you.
All right, at this time, Councilwoman Conwell.
Thank you. Through the chair, through the chair to Mr. Applebaum. And it's probably, might have been a question for Mr. Jeffers, but it switched over. So would the Sheriff's Administration building be connected or stand alone from the jail? I know you have it priced out separately, but I wondered if it was all one unit.
I can respond to that. So what we, at a minimum, the way we're doing this is to have components and sharing of major components between the two buildings. So, for example, you may recall that when we went through this, we determined that the reason we are locating the Sheriff's Administration at the jail is for economy and efficiency, and there's certain types of, anything from conference facilities and other facilities that could be shared. So we know that there is going to be a connection of the two programmatically. Right now, if you take a look at the massing models, they are physically connected. That could change, but the idea is that they're going to share services and share opportunities. Right now, it's shown as a physical connection.
Okay, so currently you don't know if it'll be physically connected.
Well, currently, the massing model shows a physical connection. We need to test that again. The assumption, the last time we went through this in more detail, the assumption was that it would be physically connected. But I also have to tell you that with the property layout, with a little more property, we can now determine whether that is in the best interest of the project. I still think it will be physically connected, but there are actually there are pros and cons to doing that, and we have to weigh that programmatically. But we know that there will be a functional connection, and the proximity is really important.
Okay, because I was thinking, looking at the price, if the building was actually connected, maybe the costs could be much lower.
Well, the assumption right now is that they are connected.
Okay. We have currently 1,610 in the jail. When the state intervened on the previous project in October or whenever it was, and they stated we had to build the jail based on the current numbers. For this project, numbers are a little lower. Could we scale back the numbers of this jail based on whenever this full conversation is done, based on those numbers? It might actually be a scale back of...
It's possible, but just keep in mind that as a general proposition, if we were at 1,600, the jail size would have to be at least 15% bigger than that. So
no matter what the number is.
But that's one component, but you also have to look at it by category as well. You have to look at where those people are, because keep in mind that you cannot, you have certain throughout the building, there's areas designated for certain uses. You can't put men where women are, where you have people with, serious SMI issues. Those are special units. So you can't just fill it up. You have to actually take a look at where areas are designated, what your population is, and how it fits. And as a rule of thumb, 15% is sort of a rule of thumb, but you have to get more specific. But once again, it's possible that it could be smaller than 1904. It's possible it could be larger, but you also wouldn't build it out with no flexibility. You wouldn't build it out because today it's at 1,600, and if it went to 1,650, you'd be in trouble. You have to have some flexibility. But, generally speaking, all I'll say is if we can lower the population and keep it consistently lower before we lock in a lot of this design, it's to everyone's advantage for every reason that you can imagine.
Thank you.
At this time, Councilwoman Cheryl Stevens.
Thank you for showing us additional sources and uses of funds. We know that since this is an institutional use with state and federal oversight, there are some things that we can't totally control. And everyone would love to do value engineering that would allow us to squeeze the most we could out of every corner of the building. But unfortunately, what I'm seeing in the last 3 years of construction, we talked about before, is consistently the prices are going toward the maximum, not the minimum. And I've had cases where on substantial projects, contractors have walked away because they can't get product or supply on a timely basis, and the next party that you can go to charges you 50% more. So I see that since our original conversation about a 15% increase in inflation, you've come up with 27.5.
No, I have to, I don't mean to interrupt
Please
you.
explain that.
Yeah, okay, so I don't remember any I've never said 15%. Here, there are different conversations. The only number I have given you from October to now, you can go back and listen to each meeting. I've said from October to now, it has been averaging about 5% per annum. So numbers were really high, and even through October, November, December, they were still a little higher. They've come down a little bit. So if you annualized inflation, construction inflation, from October until now, the annualized number is about a little under 5%. This 27.5%, that's what that is talking about. When we originally went back, and I'm going to take you back to October of last year. So there came a point in time in the fall of last year when we were talking about, we were going back to the numbers from 2.5 years before that, 2 years before that. When we started out, you remember it was at 550. That was 2.5 years ago. So last year we were talking about why it grew from 550 to 750. And that's where we went through the explanation of what was really dramatic inflation that occurred after COVID. So we went back and talked about what happened in 21, in 22, and we projected. Now, actually, if you went back to last October, the number that we were using to escalate from previous budgets was actually 28%. The 27.5% is just that actual. That's confusing. What I'm actually showing you is the 750. We have a little savings. There's a 0.5% inflation savings. So the 750 could have maybe been whatever that is, 747 or something like that instead of 750. But the inflation, so we had really big inflation after COVID, really high, really superbly high. Now, by the way, Mr. Schron, Councilman Schron thinks it's even going to get less.
Not yet.
Right now, it's around 5%. It could go higher, it could get less. But the one point I will make to you is, and this is very important, that's a general number, but what has happened is in a lot of areas, there are some specialty contractors and there's some areas where there's limitations of competition or availability. They can spike prices in certain areas. There can be things you cannot get. One of the things that happened in Columbus, they had a real problem down there because they assumed, and this was before all this, they assumed a certain type, a certain cell type. They assumed a certain type of material. They couldn't get it. Now, they didn't test it ahead of time the way they should have. But that created a big problem. That is why, and I say this again, I think this is a responsible budget. It does have contingency built into it. But you know, it's not a guarantee at this point in time. We haven't even designed for the site yet. It is a reasonable budget number at this stage in the process.
So, are you making a projection on what inflation could impact this project? And is it included in the existing 5% contingency?
Right now, the answer is if we can start now, and if we can get to a midpoint of construction, literally in about within 2 years, so that we start now and keep moving, 750 does include that consideration. But if we don't start now, that escalates. And I'll tell you, I mean, if I could have raised this a few dollars, I would have. But I think 750 is still is reasonable right now, and it's a reasonable budget right now. If we can get started right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President.
Right. At this time, Councilman Dale Miller.
Mr. President, thank you. And I had a question about the 27.5% escalation, which Mr. Applebaum answered for us. Thank you.
This time, Councilwoman Sunny Simon.
Thank you. What's frustrating to me is that you were here maybe 3 to 4 weeks ago at that podium and you indicated the cost of the project would be $53 million more than the 750.
I went back and I heard you say that. I went back, I listened, and I did not say that.
Okay.
I'm
confused.
I have a world of respect for you, but I have to tell you.
So maybe we should replay that. We'll look at that because it's hard to believe you did say that. You said with inflation, it would exceed the 750. You did. The cost.
No.
This is different than a budget.
What I said, and I will say it again, and if I was not clear, I will correct myself now. What I believe I said was if you took exactly the same thing that we had in October, that part of it you would inflate at around 5%, and I believe I said that you wouldn't inflate the property, but the rest of it you would inflate. You would inflate it at about 5% times $700 million. It's 30, you know, it is what it is, $35 million. So yeah, if you took exactly the same thing and you did the same thing now as you did then, it would be more. But once again, we're going to use the 750 because we are talking about taking out some things we're changing. We're taking out structured parking. We're taking out some foundation. So you do have the opportunity to make it less. It doesn't bring it all the way back to 750. I mean, you're going to have to find some other opportunities if you just do the math. But we always look at those opportunities. I mean, you know, could we start this process at 775 or 800? Yes. And then, you know, to get to your point, would we have hopefully more savings at the end? Yes. But it's a budget. As long as everyone understands the starting point of the budget and the assumptions, It's a budget.
So you want us to believe that this project was 750 in October and it's still 750?
It's not the same project. It's the project without the structured parking on a different site.
I see.
And it's a budget. And you know, we will work to that budget. I'm not saying that I am not saying $750 million in October of last year is the same number as $750 million today.
And what did you mean when you said that if you could have raised this a few dollars, you would have? You just said that.
Well, I'm a consultant. The more flexibility I have on the project, the better I like it. I know I don't normally get that benefit, but I think we can work responsibly with this budget. You always want the ability to have more flexibility if you can, but you have to do it reasonably. You have to do it within a responsible budget here.
Thank you.
And this is a responsible budget.
Further questions? Councilman?
Only to touch up on your math, you said that the inflation would be on the 750, but then you all recognize there's a bunch of items when you're answering Ms. Simon's question that don't have
Property
inflation.
doesn't inflate.
The land doesn't, and some of the other things don't. So it's not just a simple matter of 5% times 750. It's
Right. It's some number
lists
under
all those
700.
items that don't have an inflationary impact.
Correct.
Thank you.
All right, again, any further questions? Are there any further presentations?
Thank you.
And any further presentations?
I would like to present some information that was prepared by staff to council, if I could.
Floor is yours.
So there's going to be a PowerPoint. Is the clerk going to put that up? Because I'm not. Yes? So basically, while this is getting uploaded for us to look at, I wanted to give a different perspective from that which we've heard from the administration. And the starting point for my considering presenting this was that, you know, I continuously hear how this site in Garfield Heights is the center of the county, and somehow that makes a lot of sense when building a jail. But I don't know. Janina's?
Yeah, they're putting it up now.
Okay, so that's the backdrop, is I continuously hear this is the center of the county and therefore it makes sense. But I think we've seen reporting from Signal and most recently from Cleveland.com that the numbers themselves don't create a central place that would accommodate all the users of the jail. So I'm going to wait till this comes up and we can go from there. Okay. So you all will get copies handed out. So next slide. So here's just some numbers as of June 28th, a shot picture in time, June 28th, 2023. We had 1686 inmates in the jail. Most of those, 1137, came from residents of Cleveland, 67%. Second biggest user, the city of Euclid, 67 residents in the jail at that time, which is 70% of the population as of that date. The numbers from Cleveland and Euclid. Then it drops to 50 from East Cleveland and significantly drops for Garfield and Maple. So I thought it was important to see that the main users, the majority of the residents are coming, 70% are coming from Cleveland and the east side. I just want to also state that when the Juvenile Justice Center was built out on the, outside of the central Cleveland downtown area, there was talk about that there would be development around that there would be all kinds of things. Well, what we found 10 years later is that there's nothing has developed around the Juvenile Justice Center. It created a huge gap in the legal community and moved out in an isolated area that did not serve the community. And I think the Garfield site is would be similarly situated, that the community that's actually using it and the community we need to serve would be isolated and further away. One other example, I don't know if you all know, the Board of Health moved out to the outskirts from downtown, either on the edge, close to Parma, but now the residents that could utilize their clinics for vaccines and for health exams cannot get there. It's serving the community of Parma, but not those who usually and would need it the most, the underserved communities. So the next slide. So these are arresting agencies where, what districts the inmates are coming from. Again, it's Cleveland Police Department, 36%, our sheriff of these in Cleveland, and most of what districts are providing the transportation are coming from Cleveland, and of course Euclid. So again, the 2 officers will be taken off the street to transport to the jail, and we can see on the next slide how that looks. So when we talk about the Garfield site being central to the county, it in fact is. It's the center of the county. It's a red star. But the users of the 70% are coming from, as I said, the east side and from Cleveland. So it doesn't make sense to move this outside of those areas. It just creates couple problems. One is that the officers from Euclid would be taken off the street, drive to Garfield, officers off the Cleveland street, drive to Garfield, East Cleveland, and those other communities. And that causes a lot of issues for safety in those communities, not to mention the visitors that want to see their loved ones or family members in the jail would have to traverse to the Garfield site. So I just wanted to simply say that when we talk about what's central, it's central to the county because we're not getting a lot of users from Westlake, Bay Village, Olmsted Township, Strongsville, North Royalton, even Parma Independence. So it doesn't make sense by the numbers to move it to that Garfield site. Before I go on to the next slide, I want to really state how important it is for the visitors to be able to get to the people in our jail. One reason is to put money on the commissary. I mean, there's no other way for a lot of these family members to get money over to their loved ones other than physically going and putting money down. So it creates such a logistical problem to the police, to the family members, and as well as to the Justice Center. But I want to go to the next slide, if I can. So what I've heard is that, well, the visitors can do this remotely. They can visit everything's done remotely now. Most of the visits are remote. Well, that's because it's really difficult. There's a lot of difficulties getting there. But if we move the jail to Garfield, that's going to totally compound the problem of the visits. But when I look at the broadband access, you could see that the areas where there's a broadband desert, where there's no access, that there's problem getting internet, overlaps with the communities that are using the jail. So it's an injustice, I believe, to further isolate the families, loved ones from those who are going to be held in our jail. And ideally, it would not be for a long period of time, but any distance is creating further problem for reentry. But you could see that it will be difficult for the people who want to visit to do so remotely. And when we passed that racism as a public health crisis, we looked specifically at the broadband access and how there's a dearth of ability to have access to the internet. So this would pose a problem for visitation to occur by broadband or internet, remote visits, and I don't think that's something we want to promote. And the next slide, again, just shows coverage. We're hoping to close that gap eventually, but right now it's not. Next one. And this is transfers. We can see that inmate transfers, we know ER runs are up, that the other visits to the hospitals are up. Each year, it's going up significantly, which would require these runs to go to Metro, presumably from Garfield to Metro, which it's a further distance, and that number keeps rising. So you could see that we're actively increasing those runs. And what this does, it creates a cost of dollars. It creates a cost of taking officers and people off the street and continuously just driving back and forth. And now it's a further distance. Next one. Sheriff runs, same thing. These keep going up. Outpatient runs, our sheriff is running back and forth as well, as right now apparently we have a deal with Cleveland that their EMS is doing the transport, but this includes our sheriff going back and forth and having two people in a vehicle and safety issues. I think somebody in the open meeting spoke to the safety issues associated with transport. And I understand there has to be transport, but this just exacerbates the time travel and those considerations by quite a bit, as we'll see. Next. Okay, wait, I just want to touch upon the transportation for the public, for visitors to go to the jail if it moves to Garfield. There's our RTA system. Rapid transit is considerably available to residents, especially Cleveland East Side, and we'll take those visitors right downtown by rapid transit. But there's nothing like that at Garfield. Next. Here is a picture as it sits today of the transportation opportunity by bus. And you could see that, I think Ms. Liu spoke to the one route, 90, that is the only one that will take you right to Garfield. And even if they have some nice entryway there, but there's just one route, and it will take several transfers for those people living in Euclid and Cleveland, East Cleveland areas, even outside of the east side, any place else to get there. It's going to be very difficult to travel to Garfield for people who don't have cars, people who don't have money, people who have to take 2 to 3 transfers to get there just to put some money on the commissary or to visit a loved one. It's a lot to ask. It's a lot to ask of the community that we are here to serve, I believe. Next one. So you could see that Euclid, I represent Euclid, there's no question about that, but I want to say that Euclid is on the edge of our county. And so goes Euclid, so goes the county. That's why we've invested in Euclid, the lakefront, to make sure that it's vibrant, that people will be not moving from Euclid, but moving into Euclid. So it's important that that we support their safety plan, and what this would do if we move the jail to Garfield would increase the time, travel time from Euclid to the county, and in each of these cities, even Lakewood increases significantly to get the officers off the street. Garfield's really close, Maple's close. And the transfers, with the RTA, that doubles. So for somebody in Euclid now, take 1 transfer. If we move it to Garfield, it's 2, and everything goes up except for Garfield and Maple, obviously. Next. This is just drive time to current jail. It just goes up 10 minutes at least for each of these cities except Maple and Garfield. Increases time. Next. And Signal reported it, the drive time's even more than that. And this is, again, just giving the Cleveland Police times. One district, a couple districts are pretty close to Garfield, but as you go further east again, where we're getting most of the traffic, it's significantly longer to get there. Next. And I just want to end by saying that we want to have family contact during incarceration. We know that matters. We know that the isolation is going to increase the rate of recidivism. And I hope that these considerations would at least be before my colleagues when they make a decision on a jail site. And I think this is important. It's unfortunate that we don't have a lot of choices now, but we do have Eddie Kirby that we're looking at, which would be address and be more central to the people actually using this jail, and over 70% of those who occupy it. So I thank you for your time.
All right, Councilwoman. Are there any questions of our colleague? Okay. Not at this time. We have our 3 agenda items before us. Is there anything else that needs to be considered as we look to move forward?
Mr. President, there's a proposed substitute sponsored by me and my colleague, Councilman Gallagher, at this time, if that is something you want to address. It's a substitute for Resolution 2023-0182. Is this a proper time to address that substitution?
Fine.
Or should we read the actual item again?
Go right ahead.
Okay, so this, I think all of you have a copy of this proposed substitute. What this proposed substitute says and will do is that it will provide the administration an option to enter into an option agreement with the sellers of the Garfield Heights property and have that property preserved up until December of 2024. But there can be no outright purchase of that property without the contingency of a sales tax extension being passed in any form. So basically it says the administration can protect this property and have time to get the funding to build a jail campus or a jail, but cannot purchase this property outright without a way to actually fund the construction. And would ask my colleagues to consider this as a fair compromise and not jeopardize losing this property, but at the same time not jeopardizing our taxpayers by purchasing property without the ability to build on it.
So, Councilman?
Thank you, sir. Last week, I was trying to figure out obviously, we've all been struggling with this issue, and not just for a week or two. It's been quite a while. And I was trying to figure out how do we get this ball moving? How do we, as a body, get the county moving in a direction that we could all be a little bit more comfortable than we were? Many phone calls with Councilwoman Simon, who I consider to be one of the more important voices regarding this because of her issues that she just put out there. This is something that affects us all. This is something that affects all the taxpayers, especially. Mr. Applebaum gave us a presentation here, and again, there are still skepticism on the final cost, and we won't know that until we start taking steps forward. I thought this was a proper way forward to afford the administration the leeway to start discussing Garfield as our spot, to allow the use of the $53 million in ARPA funds for the administration to start the process of building the jail there. We're not dedicating right now that it's going there, but we're going to allow the administration to move forward with the option to buy that property. This isn't a perfect world, and this is not perfect legislation. It's probably very easy to poke holes in this. I've worked as best I could with the administration on this and with other stakeholders within the community of Cuyahoga County. I've talked to my colleagues as much as I could to get support for this issue, and I feel comfortable that we have worked as close as we could with the administration to get a formula in place to help us move forward on taking care of what now is one of our biggest, if not our biggest issues in Cuyahoga County. The question on whether or not we need a new jail, we need a new jail. The question on whether or not can it be rehabbed or in the same spot, it cannot. It cannot. And sadly, it cannot. We had a spot, we don't have a spot. I was on the committee where we looked at over 50 properties in the city of Cleveland and surrounding areas. We whittled that down into the 30s. As much as I say sometimes negative things about that committee, not but the individuals put in long, hard hours to get down to 3 or 4 properties. We then had to go back out and look for other options because things weren't working out. Garfield was the only one that answered that request. Then that became a reality, discussions ensued, and it's been quite some time that we've been discussing other issues. The property over Kirby also came up. I think this gets this council and this administration as close as we're going to get on the same track to move forward. And I look forward to any discussion that we can have about this. Your opinions matter.
Mr. President?
Yes, Councilman.
I appreciate it. Just a couple questions, I suppose. I don't know if they're rhetorical or if they can be answered, but my concern about the substitute legislation is the practical, real-world complications that might arise. I mean, one of the questions I have is, if administration can support this or not, isn't there a 120-day initial due diligence built into the agreement as it stands, number one? And then number two, isn't there also a 90-day extension, for any reason whatsoever, and then a financing extension? I mean, don't we have these safeguards already built into the existing agreement?
And if we could, Mr. King, could you come forward to be prepared?
Yeah, we actually.
Mr. Dever, if you could state your name for the record.
Michael Dever, Director of Public Works of Cuyahoga County. Our earlier presentation, I don't know if it's possible to bring it up. I had a couple additional slides in case a question did come up to just show specifically the terms.
Ryan Jeffers, CBRE consultant on real estate. So that slide will hopefully be up here in just a moment. Basically, terms that are proposed, Councilman Tuma, you are correct. I'll run through briefly how the proposed contract was structured. The due diligence period does have 3 tranches. When, if there's a time that the property does go under contract, then the initial deposit that is placed is $750,000. That is a fully refundable amount. That is a fully refundable amount during that first 120 days of due diligence. And that's a pretty typical structure. When you're acquiring property, you put down a deposit, you have a window of time to do your investigations, your physical studies. And then if at some point, for any reason, you determine that you need to withdraw from that contract, you are able to do so and your money is refunded. The next period of, there we go. Thank you.
Back it up.
The next period of due diligence is a 90-day extension. It is an extension that is available for any reason. It is at the county's leisure to exercise that. If they do, then what happens is that $750,000 earnest money is increased to $850,000 of that amount. $200,000 would be what we would call hard money on the contract. That means that that $200,000 is no longer refundable if the county withdraws for any reason it desires. That goes to the seller of the property for their time and effort and your right to control it for that period of time. That first 90-day due diligence extension, again, is for any reason. The next tranche of time is another 90-day due diligence extension. When we were negotiating this, this was the one that we had to work harder for, because at that point, you are looking at having the property under control, under your unilateral control for up to 300 days. That's a 10-month, give or take, window. So The terms on that are the same in terms of the earnest money. An additional 100 goes in. $200,000 of the total earnest money are then hard on the contract, meaning they are not refundable. Mind you, even though the money is not refundable, it all still applies to the purchase price if you do close in the contract. Again, that's a pretty typical structure. That second 90-day extension, because the seller was not comfortable allowing it for any reason to be a unilateral option at the county's leisure, it was specifically intended to address financing matters. And so at that point, the seller's view, and I will tell you that it's not an unreasonable one, is you will have had the opportunity to assess the physical nature of the property, its buildability, look at title matters, anything you'd like to do there. At that point, the only thing, and we made the argument for, was to have additional time to make sure we had financing in place. So we had contemplated that this would be necessary. We had put these into the contract at that time with those timeframes.
Okay, I appreciate that. So at the very least, you're looking at, my math is probably wrong, but it's like 17 and a half months without the $200,000 for that first extension.
What is the 17 and a half months?
120 days plus the 90 days, then that's when you'd kick in the 200,000 at the first extension?
The seller of the property is not willing to wait that long to go under contract. They would be looking to go under contract in probably the next 60 days.
So would the seller of the contract be willing to wait until possibly December of 2024?
The way that this contract is set up, and we have talked to the seller, they are not, as of right now, willing to give you the guarantee that they will wait.
So the possibility that this entire deal would be killed if we pass this legislation, does that exist?
So yeah, I believe this legislation, from what I understand, and I'm not a legislator nor an attorney, but I just believe it's an umbrella, that this contract does meet certain parameters of it, and that if it gets to a point where you still need to get that financing in place, then it's incumbent upon us to go to the seller and try to seek out an extension. But the contract, the purchase contract that's proposed, they are not willing to guarantee you that additional time. That would be more or less another 6 months after this window here.
So I guess I'm trying to get, so you're saying that they would not be willing to go beyond what these terms are currently in the contract, even
today
if we did
they
this
are not.
legislation?
Today they are saying,
as of today,
we'll be able to do a 300-day window at these terms.
Mr. President, can I add something to Mr. Tuma? I think what's important to understand is that this is not a mandatory wait. There's flexibility in this, that the option, they could exercise this option sooner than later, and that was with the input from the law director, that there's no necessity that this go on till December of '24. It just kept out to give more time.
No,
So I think
understand
that, okay, good. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My concern is that as of last week, I know there were several council people who were opposed to the Garfield site. And so if this is a spanner in the works to try to derail funding for it, then it's a perfect way to do it by letting it go beyond 6 months. So I just don't, I hope the sincerity is there. I just don't know that it is. So.
My understanding is that it provides flexibility, but again, I'm not a legislator nor an attorney.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that means, Mr. Tuma, but yeah, it's kind of unclear.
Here's what it means, Ms. Simon, is that we can vote either to extend the sales tax soon, or we can put it on the ballot and let people vote on it if that's how we decide to go. We could do that as soon as we can possibly do. I mean, so.
Good point. So this gives the ability to let the executive do that.
Yeah, I think we already have he would already have the ability to do that if we entered it as is. That's just my opinion. You have your opinion, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, at this time, Councilman Gallagher has the floor.
Yeah, I think we're here all in good faith. I take a bit of offense to that. The reality is, if there's a better idea, Mr. Tuma, I'm going to sit back and wait for it.